Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Protect Your Farm Business, where we talk about things that are related to agribusiness topics. And so this week, I decided to come on here and discuss what's happening in the agricultural sector as we see these effects of COVID-19 ripple through the supply chains. And what does that mean for Idaho producers, but producers in general? So I wanted to discuss this because we've been reading articles left and right about producers dumping milk, onions being buried, giving out free potatoes. So have you all seen this? Have you read these articles? Have you seen most of these articles that have been coming out regarding this idea of food waste and people not being able to find markets for their agricultural commodities? And so I think that it really caught me by surprise when I saw a New York Times article discussing our Idaho onion grower burying over 1 million pounds of onions. And I think that was very surprising to me. And so since then, I've been doing a lot of research and reading a lot of articles, and I would just like to explain some things to you guys. So as you might have seen, more and more Idaho crops are being discussed in this idea of food waste or dumping agricultural commodities. And so when I've heard this, I wanted to dig into some of the Idaho commodities that I would be referencing. And so over 1 million pounds of milk is being poured out a day in Idaho. The beef prices have seen about a 30% drop. So those are box beef prices. We've seen those prices drop drastically over this time of the coronavirus. Our Idaho potatoes have seen not enough processing capacity. We've been seeing some farmers take their potatoes and put it onto an open lot for people to come and pick up potatoes for free. And so we've been seeing these things happen across different channels in all different types of products. And so I just wanted to talk about it today. So as some of you might know, Idaho's top agricultural product is not potatoes. I know, Idaho, famous potatoes. It's on our license plates. But we're actually a very large livestock state. More than half of the agricultural revenue in this state comes from milk and beef livestock. So when our livestock industries are hurting, we need to pay attention to that because our state relies on our livestock production. So I wanted to discuss what's happening in the supply chains as it's related to Idaho products. And so what does the supply chain look like for our Idaho producers? And so today I'm going to dive into our 3 largest industries in Idaho, discussing their supply chain. So let's start with a dairy producer. So if you have a dairy, then you are the first line in the supply chain. And where does the milk go from the dairy to the consumer at home? Well, in Idaho, most of our dairy is used to make cheese. Here in the Magic Valley, a lot of our milk is made for cheese. So we think of the dairy farm, you then transport it to a processing facility, which then transports it to a retailer of some sort, and then it goes into consumers' homes. And so if you want to think about it, say I have my own dairy, Westerhold Dairy, and I sell my milk to a cheese processor here in the Magic Valley. And they make cheese for Pizza Hut. Well, under COVID-19 regulations and stay-at-home orders, let's say Pizza Hut has had to decrease or is decreasing 40% of what they're normally giving out in pizzas a week. They've had to reel that in, about 40%. Well, who is making up that cost? Who is struggling to then make less milk, which then has less cheese, which Pizza Hut is not buying? So if you think about it, We as producers, you guys are very efficient. Every day the cow needs milked twice or three times a day, usually. And so what does that mean? I'm not just able to cut off a milk supply in a day just because Pizza Hut is not able to sell pizzas. And so becomes really hard to then have that ripple through the supply chain. So when the cheese processor then reduces the amount of milk they are taking in because their demand is less, then on the other side, the dairy producer is going to see a smaller farm gate price because the processor has a lot of supply that they're able to buy, and they are a single processor, and maybe they're working at a percent of where they were processing. Well, that's what's happening. And we're seeing that with dairy being dumped or milk being dumped across the US. And so according to a news article in the Post-Register in Idaho, the combination of restaurants, oversupply of milk, low cattle prices, and the disruption of exports is ganging up on the dairy industry. And so not only is the dairy industry seeing the milk price being low, they're also not able to sell their cull cows as a higher price as they were. And so milk prices are really declining. And so the producers are having to dump out the milk, which can be very scary and sad, especially when we think that at the supermarket, our milk prices are higher. Well, they're not higher, but we are seeing less and less milk on the shelves. Well, the milk that I'm making is not going to the milk on the shelves, it's going to cheese, which is a different product and it's a different process. And so it's just something to think about when we ask the question, why do I see less milk on the market shelves if we have overproduction? And so it's just a good question to ask and look into. So when we think of the next area that I would like to dive into of beef production. And so the supply chain of beef is really this cow-calf, which is the cow-calf producer. And then you have maybe a backgrounder or stalker, and then you sell to feedlots, which then feed them until they go to packers or processors. Well, each stage of that cycle has fewer and fewer entities, which means that there's more market power for those entities because there's not a lot of competition. So according to a study done back in 2011, 80% of all beef in the US is processed through the big four meat packers: Tyson, Cargill, JBS, USA, and National Beef. So news has been coming out discussing these plants shutting down or running at a lower capacity. And so JBS shut down its Greeley, Colorado beef facility last week. National Beef Packing has also closed their plant in Tama, Iowa. Cargill halted production at certain locations. And so what does that mean for beef producers? Well, if packers and processors aren't taking beef cattle into their plants, feedlots are holding the cattle longer on feed, and then they're not going to be buying from cow-calf producers as much because they're holding on to a lot of cattle. Additionally, U.S. beef is used for mostly expensive cuts. So we produce really good beef. We are known to have some of the most expensive cuts from our beef industry. And so an impact that is happening in the beef industry is that those expensive cuts are used in restaurants. And so with restaurants mostly down in sales, which is a major market for the beef producers, it's becoming a situation where the meat packers aren't having as much demand for those high expensive quality cuts. And they're also seeing the pressure from all of these plants testing for COVID-19 and finding positive tests in a lot of these plants, which is then causing processors to really be working at low capacity compared to where they were. So if we aren't processing meat, then they're not going to be buying beef cattle to then process the meat. So it's just kind of a perfect storm. An ag economist from Texas A&M said, we have a lot of beef supplies still, but we might have a lot less demand this summer, again, for those high quality cuts. And so for Idaho, our supplies are even more strained, I would say, with the beef, because not only are the beef producers trying to get into processing, but we have dairy cull cows that are also going into beef processing. And so with the dairy prices low, dairy producers might be culling at a higher rate. Therefore, those beef prices are impacted not only by beef producers, but also dairy producers. So then let's discuss our Idaho potato chain. We have our potato farmer, we have the processor, we have the retailer, and then we have the consumer. So say I grow potatoes again. Well, then I would sell to a potato processor. Well, say that potato processor makes French fries. Well, all of those French fries are sent to maybe chain restaurants or restaurants in general. Well, if the food service numbers are down and restaurants are not open and maybe down in their sales by 80 to 85%, then the processor has to decrease their processing because they can't pay for their employees if there's no demand on their side. Well, if they're reducing their processing capacity, then the farmer is not able to sell their potatoes to the processor. So it's coming down the chain of where the consumer is, to where the retailer is, to where the processor is, to all the way down to the producer level. So I've referenced a lot of articles and I've looked through a lot of articles, and this is a really interesting topic, but people need to understand that a lot of our products not only are in the grocery stores, but they're in restaurants, which are now not running at full capacity, therefore making the supply chain behind it maybe not run at full capacity. And so potatoes are still in the ground. We're still going to harvest them. Dairy cows are still going to be milked. There will be milk out there. It's just where in the line do we send our products? And that can have a different effect on different producers. So I just wanted to come on and discuss a little bit of these topics as we are hearing them more and more in the news. Again, I referenced a lot of news articles and I put them into the description box. And if you found this interesting, next week we can talk about it a little bit more, maybe if you have some broader questions. And so right now I'm opening the live up to questions, which I'm very grateful. We do have a question today. And so I have the question: do you foresee the potential of an ongoing influence on farmers, such as farmers being more hesitant to sell to all the restaurants even after all this is over? And so that's a great question. I think a lot of our producers are thinking more of direct marketing now that this has been happening. So maybe direct marketing instead of working through a processor, working with restaurants. I think that we're seeing a big push in this local food system type of approach. And I think that could be something that we consider for the future of somewhere where our commercial producers could fit into. But I am not sure on the ongoing influences and farmers being more hesitant to sell at restaurants. I think they would love to sell to restaurants, but where I'm talking about in the supply chain, it's more of the processors selling to the restaurants, not direct farmer to restaurants. So hopefully that answered your question. If not, please email me. Any more questions? Okay. Well, with that, again, if you're interested in topics like this, where we read a lot of articles and maybe give you some information, let us know. and I hope to see you next week. I think that I'll have one of my colleagues actually come live next week, so it won't be my face next week, which might be fun for you guys. So with that, thank you for listening, and come back next week.